faithfully delivering value and interpreting great books from around the world. Hi, this is Sally's Book Talk. The French Revolution marked the dawn of modern politics. Through blood and fire, it solidified principles of civil rights and freedom, becoming the cornerstone of today's world. Today, I'll discuss this book called History of the French Revolution, the first classic work on the revolution. Its author, Mignet, was a famous 19th century historian and an authority on the French Revolution. His book is hailed as a classic in the field. It's generally thought that the French Revolution began in 1789 and ended in 1804, lasting 15 years. Though short, it was incredibly complex, with major events piling up, key figures emerging like shooting stars, only to vanish quickly. So the whole French Revolution feels dazzling and tough to wrap your head around. But Minet's book's biggest strength is its clear organization. He lays out the revolution's origins and outcomes, its violent and terrifying aspects, and the choices and fates of all kinds of people involved, crystal clear. In the next part, I'll use the founding of the French First Republic in September 1792 as a turning point, splitting it into two episodes. The first covers the revolution's start. From 1789 to 1792, I'll explain why the revolution erupted and how it advanced. What roles did folks like Louis XVI, Lafayette, and Mirabeau play? The second episode is the climax phase, from 1792 to 1804, when Napoleon was crowned. I'll describe the peak and end through figures like Robespierre and Danton. And finally, I'll briefly cover France's political direction from 1794 to 1804. Now, let's dive into the first episode on the revolution's start. First up, the origins of the French Revolution. Why did it happen? To sum it up in one line, it was the result of various factors working together. These factors include financial crisis, ideological crisis, and social inequality. After the reigns of Louis XIV and Louis XV, France had become Europe's dominant power, with colonies in Africa, Asia, and North America. Domestically, France practiced absolute monarchy, with the king wielding total control over the nation and its people's fates. However, beneath the surface prosperity lay a severe financial crisis. Turns out both Louis XIV and Louis XV were obsessed with grandiose achievements. During their combined 130-year reign, France constantly waged wars against neighboring countries, fighting the Dutch, British, Spanish, Austrians, and Prussians. These endless wars drained France's finances and manpower while both kings lived extravagantly. They built opulent palaces, kept mistresses, and indulged in debauchery, causing court expenses to skyrocket and burdening the nation. By the time Louis XVI took the throne in 1774, the treasury was nearly empty. Yet despite this, Louis XVI still supported the American Revolution. In July 1776, Britain's North American colonies declared independence. France sent troops across the ocean to aid the Americans against Britain and loaned them huge sums. That was Louis XVI's move. This stemmed from diplomatic strategy. France and Britain were old rivals, so France jumped at any chance to weaken Britain. But such a massive overseas war only poured fuel on France's financial fire. When America won independence in 1784, France's treasury was practically emptied. What shocked Louis XVI more was how the American Revolution boomeranged. To threaten his own rule, Washington's rebels opposed British rule precisely because they saw the king as a tyrant in North America. From day one, the American Revolution branded monarchy as evil. Their declaration proclaimed all men free and equal, directly challenging divine right and hierarchy, the core of monarchy. Yet France itself practiced absolute monarchy. French kings held far more power than British monarchs. Domestic discontent had simmered for years, and America's revolution armed critics with ideological ammunition. They quoted the Declaration of Independence to demand immediate reforms in France. The Marquis de Lafayette stood out most prominently. A legendary figure, he was born aristocratic, but Enlightenment ideals fueled his lifelong passion for liberty and democracy. When the American Revolution erupted, he was electrified, seeing America as freedom's beacon. In 1777, just 20 years old, Lafayette sailed to America, fought alongside Washington, and became a key revolutionary leader through passion and brilliance. His greatest contribution was in 1781, commanding the Franco-American forces to win the decisive victory at Yorktown. This battle forced the main British forces to surrender, turning the tide of the war. After the American Revolution ended, Lafayette returned to France and received a hero's welcome. From the court to nobles and even common folks, everyone praised him unanimously. Lafayette's reputation peaked. But Lafayette didn't rest on his laurels. He started spreading ideas of freedom and equality, calling to abolish the class system. It should be noted that, after all, Lafayette was a noble. He wasn't seeking to abolish monarchy, but to establish a constitutional monarchy. Lafayette believed Louis XVI was upright and kind-hearted, so persuading him to abandon absolute monarchy and achieve constitutional politics was possible. Lafayette's proposals sparked strong reactions across French society. Some supported him, some opposed him, and others felt conflicted. Specifically, one's attitude depended on their social status. At that time, the French were divided into three estates. The first estate, clergy, the second estate, nobility, and the rest, including peasants, bourgeoisie, urban residents, were grouped into the third estate. These three estates were unequal. The clergy and nobility had extensive privileges, forming the privileged class. Their main perk was tax exemption. No matter how high taxes got, they didn't touch the privileged class. Since they were tax exempt, taxes fell squarely on the third estate. So court costs, war expenses, and government outlays were all shouldered by the third estate. And that's not all. The privileged were feudal lords, owning 2/3 of France's land. The third estate had to pay steep rents to lease it. Additionally, the church had a key income source, the tithe, meaning a 1/10 levy on believers' personal income. So, since the third estate were mostly believers, this money was unavoidable. So, adding it up, the third estate paid three types of dues. First, taxes to the state. Second, rents to feudal lords. Third, tithes to the church. In other words, the royal family, nobility, and church were all fleecing the third estate. French society was propped up by their wealth. Compared to their contributions, the third estate's social status was far too low. In front of the privileged class, the third estate was subservient and dignity less. They had no voice or participation in major state policies. The third estate deeply resented this, especially as commerce, industry, and finance developed, empowering those with assets, knowledge, and skills who became its core strength. They desperately wanted to change this unfair and unreasonable system. So when Lafayette proposed constitutional monarchy, the third estate welcomed it. They saw him as an enlightened noble and strongly backed him. But enlightened nobles were few. As the saying goes, where you stand depends on where you sit. The vast majority of the privileged class opposed reform. They knew reform meant reducing privileges and harming their interests. What about Louis XVI's view? Well, he was conflicted. Reducing the privileged class's exemptions, Louis XVI liked that. It would help solve the financial crisis. But achieving this through constitutional monarchy, he hated that idea because it weakened his own power. Ultimately, Louis XVI decided to reform without changing absolute monarchy. In 1775, his second year on the throne, He appointed Turgot as finance minister to plan reforms. Turgot proposed abolishing tax exemptions for clergy and nobles. The privileged must pay taxes at third estate rates. The benefits were clear. First, state revenue would surge, potentially solving the financial crisis. Second, tax fairness would satisfy the third estate. Louis XVI approved the plan. The privileged class's reaction was predictable. They used noble-controlled high courts to resist. Specifically, whenever reforms threatened their interests, high courts denied legality, blocking implementation. Had Louis XVI stood firm, he could have subdued the courts. That he lacked resolve, facing privileged resistance, Louis XVI caved in 1776. He dismissed Turgot, hoping to appease them. Later, Louis XVI appointed Necker, Calonne, and others as finance ministers. Their roles resembled Turgot's, cutting spending, adjusting taxes to include the privileged but with milder tactics. The problem? The privileged class remained immovable, rejecting all reforms, no matter how enlightened nobles like Lafayette pleaded. Thus, reforms reached a stalemate, placing Louis XVI in an awkward position. He started the reforms, angering the privileged class, yet lacked resolve to see them through, deeply dissatisfying the third estate. Now, Louis XVI pleased no one. Reforms stalled, the financial crisis worsened, and the government resorted to issuing bonds. By 1787, the government had issued over 1.6 billion livres in bonds, far beyond repayment capacity. The main bond buyers were the Third Estate, but they feared the government couldn't repay when bonds matured, wiping out their investments. Facing crises, Louis XVI convened the Assembly of Notables in 1787, where Lafayette proposed summoning the Estates General. The Estates General meant clergy, nobility, and the Third Estate, each sending delegates to confer. How to resolve the current crisis? Lafayette's proposal resonated with the Third Estate. Petitions snowballed into Louis XVI's hands. Louis XVI felt dragging things out was untenable. Better to gather everyone to brainstorm solutions. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General convened at Versailles Palace outside Paris. Lafayette attended as a noble delegate, beginning another legendary chapter. During this, Lafayette witnessed many pivotal historical events. Three deserve detailed mention. First, the tennis court oath. After convening, the three estates were assigned separate halls at Versailles for debate, voting only after reaching conclusions. Voting was one vote per estate. This clearly disadvantaged the Third Estate, since clergy and nobles shared interests and always aligned. Thus, the privileged class could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1. The Third Estate refused this. They demanded rule changes, all estates debating together, then voting per person, majority rule. With Third Estate delegates outnumbering the privileged 2-1 per person, voting would pass their proposals easily. Lafayette supported this, as mentioned earlier, deeply influenced by the Declaration of Independence. He opposed the estate system. He argued that nobles and commoners alike deserve equal rights and dignity. The Third Estate's demands struck him as perfectly reasonable. Lafayette urged the privileged class to lower their guard, break down the barriers of the estate system, and collaborate with the Third Estate. However, when core interests were at stake, the privileged class wouldn't budge an inch. The Estates General started on May 5th and dragged on till the 27th, yet the clergy and nobles still refused any changes. This stubbornness infuriated the Third Estate delegates. They lashed out at the privileged class, with the fiercest critic being Mirabeau, a noble from southern France, just like Lafayette. So here's the puzzle. How did Mirabeau, a clear noble, end up speaking for the Third Estate? That calls for diving into Mirabeau's background. Mirabeau had a wild streak. From his teens, he was defiant and unruly, even landing in prison for 4 years as a young man. That ordeal fueled his deep hatred for absolute monarchy. After prison, Mirabeau often wrote scathing articles against the French government, which shot him to fame. In 1784, after criticizing Louis XVI's favorite minister, he fled to England and embraced the idea of constitutional monarchy. Back in France, he schemed his way into politics, pushing hard to curb royal power and scrap the class system. He and Lafayette were both seen as enlightened nobles by the Third Estate, champions of constitutional monarchy. When the Estates General was set to convene, Mirabeau applied as a noble delegate, but likely due to too many enemies, he got rejected. In a rage, he ditched his noble title and got elected as a Third Estate representative. Within the Third Estate, Mirabeau and another delegate, Sieyès, rose as leaders. Under their guidance, the Third Estate dug in their heels, vowing to refuse all talks unless the privileged class backed down. By June 17, 1789, Mirabeau and Sieyès proposed ditching the privileged class and forming a National Assembly themselves. The Assembly declared it would vet all delegates' credentials. Only those approved by the Assembly could join. Then delegates would overhaul the tax system, ensuring all three estates paid their fair share, sparking fierce backlash from the privileged class. They demanded Louis XVI suppress them and force the privileged class to pay taxes, something he was all too happy to do. But he saw the National Assembly's creation without his approval as a challenge to royal power, which he couldn't tolerate. On June 20th, Louis XVI sent troops to blockade the meeting hall, declaring the National Assembly illegal and demanding immediate dissolution. The delegates didn't retreat. Mirabeau shouted that bayonets couldn't scare them away, and they rushed to a nearby tennis court to continue their meeting amid the chaos. Delegates grew intensely emotional, vowing to draft a constitution for France and reshape its government. In short, absolute monarchy couldn't continue. This became the famous tennis court oath. Lafayette supported the tennis court oath and spearheaded joining the National Assembly. Tide-turning alliances. Soon, Louis XVI's brother, the Duke of Orleans, followed suit. As momentum shifted, the privileged class began switching sides. By June 27th, 7 days after the tennis court oath, all delegates joined the National Assembly, formally transforming the Estates General. Then came another pivotal event: Parisians storming the Bastille. Facing the National Assembly's rise, Louis XVI refused to abandon absolute monarchy, massing troops until Versailles became a barracks. Seeing Louis XVI harden his stance, Finance Minister Necker despaired and resigned. Necker was a reformist moderate who consistently pushed to reduce clergy or noble privileges and elevate the Third Estate. Thus, Necker held high prestige among the Third Estate. His resignation created a disastrous impression, making reform seem aborted. The king would soon move against the National Assembly. News reaching Paris panicked citizens who backed the Third Estate and hoped the Assembly would improve their lives. For now, reformer Necker resigned, the king mobilized troops. All signs showed the National Assembly would be crushed. Delegates' lives hung by a thread, panic engulfing Paris. On July 12th afternoon, tens of thousands gathered in Paris's central squares, seeking updates, and a young man raised his arm shouting, "Citizens! Necker has been dismissed. Patriots are about to be slaughtered. Our only choice is to take up arms and resist. Panicked crowds are easily stirred up." Just like that, Parisians launched their first uprising. They seized armories, occupied the city hall, and even formed their own militia, plunging the situation into total chaos. On July 14th, the rebels stormed the Bastille. For over a century, the Bastille had been a prison for political dissidents, symbolizing French absolute monarchy. After Louis XVI ascended the throne, he implemented lenient policies and released large numbers of prisoners. By 1789, only 7 prisoners remained in its cells. So The capture of the Bastille held more symbolic weight than practical significance. Even so, historians still mark July 14th, 1789, as the symbolic outbreak of the French Revolution, because its impact was truly enormous. When the news reached Versailles, Louis XVI's first reaction was to ask the Duke of La Rochefoucauld beside him, "Is this a rebellion?" The Duke replied, "No, Your Majesty, this is a revolution." The Duke of La Rochefoucauld was correct. News of the Bastille's fall spread rapidly across the nation. Other provinces followed Paris's lead, with people rising to overthrow the old regime and rebuild local governments. In a flash, absolute monarchy's rule in France nearly collapsed. Every region became a stronghold for the National Assembly, and the nationwide revolutionary surge greatly inspired its delegates, especially Lafayette, who was ecstatic. He obtained a key to the Bastille and sent it as a gift to Washington in distant America. Lafayette accepted a new position, Commander-in-Chief of the National Guard. How did this role come about? After the Paris uprising, citizens formed an armed force and named him Commander-in-Chief of the National Guard. The citizens chose Lafayette. There were two reasons. First, the Third Estate trusted Lafayette, believing he would thwart the king's counterattack. Second, in terms of military talent and experience, Lafayette, who fought in the American Revolutionary War, was the most suitable candidate. Lafayette gladly accepted the position. This move demonstrated that the constitutionalists, led by Lafayette, enthusiastically embraced the revolution, and public sentiment at the time also favored constitutional monarchy. Next, we'll cover the third major event Lafayette personally witnessed: drafting and proclaiming the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, along with the people storming of the Bastille, deeply excited the National Assembly delegates. They believed this fully demonstrated the people's disgust with tyranny and their longing for freedom, human rights, and equality, making it essential to codify these principles in writing. On August 26, 1789, the National Assembly promulgated the famous Declaration of the Rights of Man, which categorically rejected the estate system. It declared that all men are born free and possess inalienable rights. All are equal before the law, and private property is sacred and inviolable. People noticed the Declaration of the Rights of Man closely resembled the American Declaration of Independence. Indeed, Lafayette participated in drafting and debating the Declaration and ultimately read it before the National Assembly. Deeply influenced by the American Revolution, he drew from the Declaration of Independence when crafting the French version. Moreover, the U.S. ambassador to France was Thomas Jefferson, drafter of the Declaration of Independence. Lafayette frequently consulted him, naturally shaping the rights of man. This declaration profoundly impacted human society. It affirmed and defended concepts like liberty, equality, and the rule of law. As the French Revolution's ideas spread across Europe and globally, many nations adopted it as a constitutional blueprint, their foundational principles rooted in this declaration. However, France's most urgent problem remained unsolved, as the declaration was a programmatic document outlining broad principles. It didn't specify what form of government the nation should adopt. This meant the king's status, powers, and even fate still had to be decided by the National Assembly. Therefore, which faction dominated the assembly became critical. At that time, constitutional monarchists held the advantage. Their leaders included Lafayette, who commanded significant military force. The National Guard under Lafayette could both prevent royal action against the assembly and stop radical measures endangering the king. This created equilibrium between king and assembly, enabling constitutional monarchy. The other leader was Mirabeau. After time in In England, engaging deeply with thinkers like Burke and statesman Pitt the Younger, he embraced constitutional monarchy and became a Third Estate delegate. Afterward, with exceptional eloquence and prestige, Mirabeau became an opinion leader. By the National Assembly's formation, his influence was extraordinary. So he began pushing for constitutional monarchy. Mirabeau took two steps. First, reaching consensus with the royal family, no easy feat. After years of criticizing absolute monarchy, the royals disliked Mirabeau. Queen Marie Antoinette particularly despised him, seeing him as an attention-seeking clown. Yet soon, the royals did a complete about-face. What happened? Turns out, after the revolution erupted, Paris faced a food shortage. On October 5th, 1789, 6 to 7,000 hungry women gathered outside Paris City Hall, demanding bread. The crowd was dispersed. Afterward, the women marched toward Versailles. After a long trek, they reached the palace demanding answers from Louis XVI. During the standoff, conflict erupted between the women and royal guards, plunging the scene into chaos. Luckily, Lafayette arrived with the National Guard protecting the royal family. Louis XVI also promised to supply Paris with grain. The women further demanded the royals return to Paris. Only under public watch would promises be trustworthy. Persuaded by Lafayette, Louis XVI agreed. On October 6th, the royals moved back to Paris, residing in the Tuileries Palace, with the National Assembly following. This made Louis XVI realize stubbornness could lead to disaster. He accepted Mirabeau's proposal and began cooperating with constitutionalists. Then Mirabeau took step two, submitting a proposal to form a cabinet. Mirabeau drafted a 30,000-word proposal detailing constitutional monarchy's framework. Under this plan, France's government would comprise parliament, king, and people. Their relationship. Parliament, elected by the people, wields legislative power, accountable to the people. The king holds executive power constrained by parliament. But the king could veto parliamentary bills and dissolve parliament if needed. Mirabeau's plan maximized royal powers. Of course, Mirabeau wasn't a saint. He had his own agenda. He hoped to become prime minister if the cabinet formed. Louis XVI resented this self-interest. But he understood implementing the plan would preserve monarchy, and with Lafayette's protection, his family's safety was assured. So finally, Louis XVI signed a secret agreement with Mirabeau. The deal stated that Mirabeau would persuade the National Assembly to pass his plan. In return, the royal family would pay him 6,000 francs monthly and repay his 200,000 franc personal debt. Given the situation, the constitutionalists' success seemed likely, but unexpectedly, things took a sharp downturn. From October 1789, when the royals returned to Paris, to September 1792, when the First French Republic was proclaimed. In just 2 years, monarchy was abolished, constitutional monarchy failed completely, and both Mirabeau and Lafayette, constitutionalist leaders, were disgraced. What exactly happened? In summary, these three events were crucial to the constitutionalists' ultimate failure. First, overly radical social reforms. After the revolution erupted, the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges and canceled the church's tithe. From then on, clergy and nobles paid taxes like commoners. This fulfilled the Third Estate's demand, and the privileged class was ready to comply. But what came next unsettled them. On December 2, 1789, the Assembly decreed church lands would be confiscated and nobles must return illegally held lands. Clergy and nobles owned 2/3 of France's land. This decree stripped them of most property. Furious, many privileged turned against the revolution. Ironically, this decree passed under Mirabeau's leadership. Weren't constitutionalists supposed to be moderate? Why adopt such radical policies? Simple. The financial crisis ignited the revolution, as we've discussed. The revolution toppled absolute monarchy. The financial crisis didn't fix itself. confiscating privileged lands was the fastest crisis solution. So, constitutionalists didn't choose radicalism. They were forced to stabilize things. But the cost was high. Clergy and nobles initially backed constitutionalists, but now became opponents, stripping them of major support and weakening their power. Second, split among constitutionalists. Lafayette and Mirabeau were constitutionalists, two great leaders. Logically, they should have united closely, but in reality, they looked down on each other, causing internal division among constitutionalists. They often clashed in the assembly, leading to Mirabeau's repeated, failed attempts to form a cabinet. Mirabeau's opponents also pushed the National Assembly to pass a proposal banning deputies from joining the cabinet, shattering Mirabeau's dream of becoming prime minister. Thus, constitutional monarchy couldn't be established promptly. Mirabeau was utterly exhausted. In April 1791, at just 42, he died suddenly. His remains were interred in the Pantheon in Paris. The Pantheon is where famous figures are buried. Voltaire and Rousseau rest there too. So, Mirabeau received glorious honors, but Louis XVI was devastated. With Mirabeau gone, no one could mediate between the crown and assembly. Escalating conflicts plunged Louis into such anxiety that just 2 months later, the third event occurred. The royal family's escape. On the night of June 20th, 1991, the disguised Louis XVI family slipped out of the Tuileries Palace, heading for the French border. They planned to gather forces there against the National Assembly, but were intercepted not far away. Before fleeing, Louis XVI left a letter condemning the Assembly for challenging royal authority. It also declared all laws he'd signed after the Assembly's creation were coerced and invalid. The royal flight plus this letter triggered a chain reaction. First, Parisians lost trust in the royals. Organized by radicals, they demanded harsh punishment for Louis XVI and monarchy's abolition. On July 17th, 60,000 Parisians gathered at the Champ de Mars for a protest. By evening, Lafayette arrived with the National Guard, ordering protesters to disperse. When persuasion failed, troops fired, killing about 50. The Champ de Mars massacre. By-force constitutionalists suppressed abolition demands, but at the cost of Lafayette's reputation plummeting. From national hero to tyranny's accomplice, constitutionalists' influence waned dramatically. Under constitutionalist leadership, the National Assembly passed the 1791 Constitution. Compared to Mirabeau's plan, it further restricted royal powers. Vetoing bills and dissolving parliament were abolished. Anyway, constitutional monarchy was finally established. The constitutionalist ideal was realized after a fashion. The problem was, at this stage of the revolution, things had slipped beyond the constitutionalists' control. In reality, the 1791 Constitution barely passed. Radicals resisted it in the assembly, and ordinary French citizens voiced discontent. So whether constitutional monarchy could take root depended on whether constitutionalists could calm all parties and stabilize the situation. Just then, external circumstances turned against them. After the revolution erupted, some nobles and clergy fled abroad seeking aid. Prussia and Austria eagerly formed an Austro-Prussian army, invading France to profit from the chaos. In April 1792, the coalition reached the French border town of Brunswick and issued the Brunswick Manifesto, warning the French to restore Louis XVI's full powers and absolute monarchy, or face unforgettable punishment. Far from helping Louis XVI, the manifesto ignited French fury. People believed Louis had orchestrated it all. He'd collude with the invaders to crush the revolution. They couldn't just wait for doom. On August 10th, 1992, Parisians launched their second uprising. Rebels seized Paris, imprisoned Louis XVI, and demanded the Assembly abolish monarchy. By then, the Assembly had no choice. On September 21st, The assembly renamed itself the National Convention, becoming France's supreme authority. On the 22nd, the convention abolished monarchy and proclaimed a republic. The first French Republic was born. Lafayette had tried ordering the National Guard to stage a coup, but troops refused. This destroyed his reputation, forcing him into exile. Meanwhile, Mirabeau's secret pact with the royals was exposed. People realized his advocacy for constitutional monarchy wasn't for national interest, as he claimed, but for personal gain. Thus, Mirabeau was disgraced, his remains removed from the pantheon. Both leaders ruined, the constitutionalists crumbled. From September 1791, when they drafted the Constitution, to September 1792's First Republic, constitutional monarchy lasted barely a year before being abandoned. The French Revolution turned a new page. All right, that wraps up part one of the French Revolution. Key takeaways are below the audio, and we'll cover part two tomorrow.